And we're back on Shardlight Radio. I'm your host, Mr. Ben, and this episode is a couple days late. My normal recording day of Wednesday, my Versus System podcast, The Build Phase, hit episode 200 this week, and the celebration around that was a whole bunch of people from the Versus community sent me clips that I edited together and had this kind of tribute to the game of Versus, but the editing of that took a tremendous amount of time, and then my boy came down with strep throat, so it's been a wild couple of days, and I apologize that this episode is a few days late. The topic of today's episode, I want to talk about tilt. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with the term tilt, this originated, as far as I know, it originated with pinball machines, where you use the flippers to hit the pinball up and down a sloped surface and try to score points, and you could nudge the machines with your hip or with your hands to influence the travel path of the ball and get a little bit more control over the results of the game than just using the flippers. Well, if you attempted to do this kind of nudging with sufficient speed or the sensors within the game would go, you've crossed over into cheating, and you'll get a little thing on the display that says tilt or has some kind of a graphic, and the flippers stop working and you lose the ball and you lose any points that you scored on that ball. Tilt in the pinball world is almost, it really is calling somebody out for cheating. It's for a foul. However, over the years, the term has kind of changed the way that people interpret it. Now, primarily in like the video game space, you will hear people talk about being on tilt as, rather than in pinball where I make the machine tilt by essentially attempting to cheat in a low-key way. Being on tilt in video games is more things are not working out for you, and now you're not playing up to your full performance due to the emotional frustration of something not working out, an unlucky bounce of a grenade in Halo or whatever it is. When somebody says they are on tilt, it's not that the game is calling them out for trying to do something they aren't supposed to. It's identifying that, hey, I'm not playing up to my optimal performance because my emotions are getting the better of my judgment. And the reason I want to talk about this topic today is because my son had his first experience with tilt over this last weekend. We played an ACQ at our local store, and in previous events at the store, my kid has done pretty well. We play at home kind of a lot. This is a new enough game that there aren't a bunch of experienced adults who know exactly what they're doing with well-tuned decks at our store. It's more we're all kind of experimenting together. But when it comes to competition, like playing a sealed event, Whitman got a little lucky with his cards. He played well and came out on top. Well, this last weekend at the ACQ, he was sitting there at the final table, undefeated versus the other guy's undefeated. This is all the marbles, essentially. And he made pretty significant misplay. He targeted Ikuma Juggernaut with the Twilight Knights coming into play effect when there was a illusion token he could have targeted to get the quickness. And of course, he didn't kill the Akuma Juggernaut, and this really frustrated him. He wanted to take that play back, and I said, no, bud, you can't. Like, we're at the store, we're playing for serious. You don't get takebacks the way you do when we're learning at home or playing just for fun. And this influenced the decisions he made on his next turn, which ultimately cost him the game. He had the Twilight Knight on board and one other character, I don't remember who. It's not really relevant. Mistcaller, I think. Again, not really relevant. And his opponent had exactly 2 towers. I believe it was dark and water. And it would have had to have been dark and water because they were non-board interactive towers. So all he had to do was attack with the Twilight Knight. His opponent, something had happened to the Juggernaut, so he had an empty board. He was able to just essentially attack at will. If he attacks with the Twilight Knight with Destroyer, he kills both towers. There's no board interaction coming his way, and then he finishes off his opponent with his Mistcaller. Well, he was a little agitated because of making that mistake in the previous turn. He declares his Mistcaller first, breaks a tower, and then it sinks in. Oh, I can't win now. I can't win this turn. And he got upset, as I think anybody would when you make a misplay in front of a bunch of people. It's embarrassing, but also he lost the game on the next turn. So not only did his mistake 2 turns in a row create this bubble of frustration, ultimately the second mistake, which I think he only made because he was on tilt, directly led to him losing the game when his opponent was able to play I think it was a Silver Watchwoman and quickness and able to push an attack through. We get out to the car and he's breaking down, crying, super upset. I feel like an idiot. People saw me make this bad play. And so we had a discussion about how losing sucks and you have to be a good sport, whether you win or lose. And to his credit, he was in the store. He saved his breakdown until we got in the car. So I'm proud of him on that point. But also he really struggled with, it's not just that he lost, it's that he lost because he made a bad play. And it's a bad play that he knew as soon as he committed to it. It's like when you make the wrong move in chess and you let the piece go and you realize in that moment, oh no. So we had a conversation about tilt management. And this is the part of the show where I hope to actually share something of value as opposed to just telling a story about parenting. I have spent 20-ish years playing card games, and I played chess obsessively before discovering Magic the Gathering, as well as other games and other avenues in life. The ability to outsmart your emotional responses is useful not just in gaming. And really at the core of this, all the advice I have is the tricks that I have learned to outsmart my own emotional responses. So the number one biggest thing I think you can do to combat tilt is be aware of your signs. Be aware of the flags that you yourself give off when you start to get a little bit too emotional, when you start to get tilted. If you're somebody who maybe starts to sweat a little bit when they get frustrated, or you catch yourself shuffling your cards a little more aggressively than you normally would, or you respond to a play your opponent makes with kind of a smart alecky comment, whatever it is, this is something that you're going to have to learn about yourself. Hey, that's a sign that I'm not behaving the way I would if I was in a normal state of mind. And the reason looking for those signs and being honest with yourself about identifying what those red flags are, the reason you got to look for that is because once you're tilted, it's kind of too late. Once you're already full on having a little frustration temper tantrum in your head, it's much harder to pull out of that than it is to identify that it's coming and take some steps to try to neutralize it and go a different path before you're fully under the influence of an emotional breakdown there at the card table, because then your performance is going to suffer. Even if you pull out of it, that takes a lot more work, that takes a lot more mental energy than just avoiding it in the first place. So when I notice little things like flipping my cards down a little harder than I should, or I'm maybe being a little bit of a jerk and responding to things like, oh, that was kind of discourteous, I think I might be getting frustrated at this game. That's when I try to set my cards down and I try to take at least one or two, depending upon how much time you have. If it's a timed game, you have to do this stuff very quickly. But if it's the beginning of the game or the beginning of the round and you're tilted from something that happened in the previous round, you've got time. And what I like to do, I set my cards down and I like to take at least one big deep breath, just in through the nose, out through the mouth. And while I'm doing that, I try to focus on the breathing. For those of you that are familiar with meditation, this is kind of a meditative technique. I possess no special expertise in the area of meditation. I'm not trying to push anybody in the direction of that practice. However, sitting in a card game, put my hand down. And for whatever reason, for me, that's important. If I've got the cards in my hand, it's hard for me to grab a hold of my consciousness and chill it out. So put my hand down, I kind of take my hands off the table and just take a second. Often I'll even close my eyes, take a deep breath, and I think about the breath as it comes in. I think about the breath as it goes out, and I use that as an opportunity to kind of hit the reset button on my thinking. Whatever it was, that bad draw from the previous game that really upset me, that smug comment that guy made when a dice roll didn't go my way, I try to clear that out of my mind and just for that moment focus on the air coming in and the air going out. And often that's enough. Often when I catch myself getting upset, taking just a moment to reset my mind is enough that I can kind of get past it and I can get back to, okay, here we go. Now sometimes it's not. Sometimes you eat brutal loss and it's not fair. There was a bad call, a judge came over and didn't know what they were talking about. There are times where one deep breath is not going to be sufficient to get your emotions back in check. And that's the kind of time where you may be in a little trouble if this is a down to the minute final game type situation, because you don't have the opportunity to really just, okay, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to breathe a few times, I'm going to go to the bathroom, shut the door, close out all the noise of the store. There are times where you have to reset yourself in real time and you have to do it almost instantly. So a technique that I have kind of stumbled into over the years is when I'm doing my deck building and testing, I tend to listen to whatever music I'm listening to, but when I start to get down to the nitty-gritty of making those last few tech card inclusions, very often I will end up with one album that I play on repeat more or less while I'm working on that deck. And there's pieces of music that are connected to the deck, and I can think about that particular bridge, or, oh, I really like that chorus, or the way that intro that song, and I start to connect parts of the music with things that my deck does. And in that way, I can kind of go back and revisit those musical moments in my head, even as I'm playing, and it has a similarly meditative benefit. I mean, really the core of what I'm talking about here is mindfulness. You just have to be mindful. You have to pay attention to your emotions before you're even aware you're feeling them. And once you are feeling them, take steps to not let them devastate your decision-making capabilities, because all your mental energy is being poured into this bad feeling. And there's a million different books and a million different techniques out there on how to be mindful. So if what I'm describing doesn't necessarily work for you, the core truth that I'm trying to get across in this show is that mindfulness is really important, and find a technique that does work for you. Take the notion, the underlying concept of what I'm saying seriously enough that even if a couple deep breaths do nothing for you, but positioning your legs a certain way, or in between rounds, just reaching down and touching your toes to get a little bit of stretching done, or sitting with your chest pushed forward so you get a little bit of better blood circulation to your brain. Things like this. Find the technique that works for you, that lets you identify when an emotional fit is coming on and then neutralize it before it happens. And absolute worst case scenario, if you end up under the duress of tilt, find ways to give yourself outs from that. Like to forgive yourself for making that misplay in the moment. And none of this stuff are things that I think you can just sort of have a surface level understanding of and then at the big table go, oh, okay, it's not a big deal that I drew poorly here. I think focusing on before the game even starts, like on the drive to the event, focusing, and probably even before that, honestly, focusing on if I make a mistake, what are the emotions I'm likely to feel? And kind of leaning into that, almost visualizing what an error would feel like, and then visualizing yourself pulling back out of that error. And whatever that technique is, find it for yourself, and you'll ultimately end up not only a better card game player, but this is a skill set that comes into play all the time parenting. I 100% assure you. So while this was not an Argent Saga specific show and was a couple days late, I hope there's some things of value that you guys can find in here, and good luck to everyone at Orlando tomorrow. Go win some games.